Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Northwest HDC webinar. I'm Jennifer Verbeck, and I'm your host for today. We're excited to have Dr. Jonathan Stoltman and Ashton Marra presenting for us today on harnessing our expertise, how the addiction workforce can work with the media to improve reporting on addiction. Couple of quick housekeeping things. First, if you have any questions for our presenters, please type them into the chat box at any time and we'll try to answer some as we go along. And then whatever ones we don't get to, we can answer at the end of the presentation. You'll also be getting an email at the end of today's webinar that has a link to a survey in it. Please make sure you're completing that survey. It helps us bring the content you're interested in, and it helps us continue offering free or low-cost events just like this one. That email will also have a link to download the slides from today and a link to our website where you'll be able to find a recording of the webinar, and that should be available later this afternoon. Additionally, we'll be sending everyone who attends this live webinar a certificate of attendance, and it takes us about a week to get those out. You don't need to do anything to get the certificate unless you're watching this in a group. And if that's the case, just go ahead and have somebody in the group email us with the names and email addresses for everyone who wants a certificate. And you'll see our email address up there on the slide. It's northwest@htcnetwork.org. All right, on to our webinar. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. We have Ashton Marra, who is the co-director of reporting on addiction. She's spent more than a decade working as a professional journalist for both public media and commercial news outlets on local, statewide, and national platforms, including NPR and ABC News. And we also have Dr. Jonathan Stoltman, who is the co-director of reporting on addiction and the director of the Opioid Policy Institute, and has worked as a researcher focusing on opioid addiction treatment and recovery since 2013. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you guys. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Wonderful. Thank you for having us. We're so excited to be here virtually. And I'll note in the corner of a few of our slides, you'll see QR codes. So if you bring your phone up to it, it should take you to relevant resources. So this one's going to take you to our homepage. And yeah, Ashton and I are really excited to be here and jump into the talk today. We'll be monitoring the chat, so feel free to ask any questions. And then at the end, there should be hopefully some time for additional questions. So just a little bit of background about who we are. It's a partnership between Ashton's group, 100 Days in Appalachia, and our group, the Opioid Policy Institute. And we launched in September 2021 as part of National Recovery Month. And we did that because Recovery Month in particular doesn't have a lot of stories about recovery in the news media or people in long-term recovery in general. And the Recovery Month seems to come and go every year with a lot of interest from advocates and researchers in the space, but not a lot of attention from the news media. So that was a really good time for us to try to launch these resources. And how we created them, it's not just Ashton and I sitting around coming up with resources for folks. We did a series of focus groups with various stakeholders, academic experts, so folks like myself, addiction scientists and treatment providers. And in all of these groups, we asked them, questions about what do they think some of the problems are with how the media covers addiction, and what are some potential solutions. And we did that with community members as well. So those are people with lived experience, or what we like to say, experts through experience. Peer recovery coaches, activists in the space, and a federal judge who runs a drug court. And then the media. So the media is really broad, of course, but we met with a lot of different stakeholders in this media group. So we met with local, state, and national journalists from various size publications and various types of publications, from radio to TV to digital first, including some Pulitzer Prize winners for specifically their work in addiction, CNNs, the ABCs of the world. So all of these different groups guided our resource creation. And then when we launched, we've continued to iterate on those discussions that we had and build out our resources since then. So a little bit about our group and our goals. Our goal overall is to create a more informed discourse about addiction. And so how we'd like to do that is through our work with the media. So we do that in 3 key domains. One of them is with professionals, so professional journalists and professional newsrooms. In our first year, we did various trainings where we worked one-on-one with journalists. And so what we do there is we build a relationship with the journalist. And if they need help sourcing a story, for example, or thinking through the wording or how they derive the narrative arc, we do a lot of that one-on-one and behind the scenes. We also do professional trainings for newsrooms. So we'll go to a newsroom, talk to the entire newsroom about addiction and addiction treatment, recovery, harm reduction. And what we try to do there is, of course, ground their understanding in current science about these issues. We then do university outreach. So we work with journalism educators and journalism students. We're at 5 universities across the country. So we have a set of curriculum that undergrad students and graduate students are learning about addiction reporting and how to do that empathetically and accurately in their future reporting and in their classes. And then, of course, student newspapers are where a lot of individuals cut their teeth, so to speak, in journalism. So we do some work and support them with training and ongoing support like we do the professionals. And then lastly, we work with experts. So I know most of the folks on this call are experts through training and through experience. We know, of course, those aren't totally exclusive groups. There's a lot of overlap between those two groups. And how we do that, and we'll talk a little bit about this today, is we provide trainings kind of like the one today. And we build a database of experts who are comfortable and familiar with the media and want to talk with their local news media. And the goal there is to try to empower experts to embrace their expertise so that you feel comfortable in those interactions and you know how to contribute to improving this narrative about addiction. And so that's Ashton's last part of the talk today. And it's a really very exciting part, and it should really leave you with some actionable tips for how to be better involved in your news media. So our goals broadly are to improve the language used by journalists. We want them to use language that's associated with reducing discrimination and stigma towards individuals. We'll talk a little bit about that today. Improving the themes and story narratives chosen by journalists. So this is why we do a lot of that behind the scenes work as they're starting to kind of come up with, hey, what is the story and how am I going to shape it? We help them try to shape the stories in ways that align with the current evidence about addiction, treatment, recovery, harm reduction, et cetera. And then, of course, improving the images and videos created by journalists. So we want to make sure that even if their story and their words that they use are really, they're aligned with what the AP guidelines and research says, and they're reducing stigma and discrimination. If they choose a headline that doesn't, or if they choose a picture that's just like a bottle of pills or an individual injecting drugs, that kind of then undercuts, of course, all of the work that they put into the text. So trying to do this broadly across all the different parts that touch with media. So I think it helps to talk a little bit about stigma and what we mean with stigma, especially addiction stigma in particular. So addiction stigma is that pervasive belief that addiction is a personal choice. And it's reflecting a lack of willpower and a moral failing from individuals. And why this matters is there's various domains within stigma. And as you can see with this definition, a lot of stigma in the addiction world focuses on that personal choice, that personal lack of willpower, and that personal moral failing. And so once we focus on the individual is to blame, you can see how that very quickly shifts to people to see, oh, that is the person is the problem, and I don't want to be around that person. And so we shun that person, we discriminate against that person, we push them to the margins of society. And we know that that leads to worse treatment outcomes. We really need to be opening our doors and making treatment more widely available, making recovery supports more widely available, making harm reduction services more widely available. So one specific type of stigma is public stigma. And this is the type of stigma that we see perpetuated by the news media. And it's really important to point out here that when we're talking about stigma today, of course, we're focused a lot on the media, but stigma isn't something that's just exclusively seen in the domain of the media, right? We all know if we're patients or providers that there can be stigma perpetuated by providers in the space, or patients can experience that in a healthcare setting. So we by no means are saying that the only problem is with the news media. And that's really important to keep in mind, especially as you're trying to think through how can I have an impact? Maybe it's not doing interviews, we'd love you to, but maybe it's trying to change this stigma and discrimination in your own practice or in your own healthcare setting as well. So public stigma, of course, is that belief that's kind of ephemeral. It's just everywhere. It's that people who use drugs are dangerous, they're immoral, they're to blame for their behavior, they're criminal. So you can see how that aligns with that addiction stigma statement that we had prior. And so what that stigma, those beliefs lead to are the actions, and the actions are that discrimination. So how stigma manifests itself is discrimination. And so therefore, employers should not hire these individuals. Landlords shouldn't rent to them, and they should be shunned again and pushed to the margins of society. So we can see here that when we're perpetuating these stories and narratives, and we're using words or images that continue to show people as dangerous, immoral, or a failure, or any of those sorts of things, it results in that direct discrimination. And of course, no discussion about stigma and discrimination is complete without talking about intersectionality. So in particular, when we think about addiction stigma, we're not really just talking about addiction, right? There's all sorts of different elements that can factor into how an individual with an addiction is treated by the media in their stories or treated by healthcare providers. Layers such as mental health, race, gender identity, region. So Ashton's from West Virginia. I did my training in West Virginia. We know how people in Appalachia are portrayed is very different than how people in the coastal parts of the country are portrayed, for example. And so that adds additional layers to that stigma. And what we're trying to do, of course, is cut out that addiction stigma, but also recognize that some of those other components of stigma and discrimination still exist, and we need to continue to make efforts in improving our reporting in those spaces as well. So quickly, how do you identify stigma in the media? Ashton's going to run through quick a little bit about the AP guidelines and some of the language advice, and we have those resources available on our website. But some of it is just this example from the Washington Post. So it's a headline about the programs, particularly in California, where the federal government will allow to pay substance abusers for staying clean. So that's obviously problematic in a couple different ways. So when we think about clean, the counterpoint to that is an individual that's dirty. Do you want to be around individuals that are dirty? Of course not. You shun those people. You don't want to be sitting next to them on the bus, in your car, waiting in line at McDonald's, whatever, right? And so just by choosing that staying clean sort of continued narrative about if you're not using drugs, you are clean and better than other people, for example, that can lead to some really problematic discrimination against individuals who currently use drugs in long-term recovery. And so the story itself was actually a really good story and talked about contingency management and did it in a really important way. But then the headline really cuts across, what they're really trying to get across, which is increasing access to evidence-based treatment, right? This other example with the baby born addicted, this group knows as well as anybody that, of course, infants can't be born addicted. But when you think about how this picture is chosen, whenever we talk about infants that are exposed to drugs in utero, it's always an infant in distress. And so now what am I thinking about if I'm a person in the general public that's looking at this picture? I'm not thinking like, wow, this is a great mom or this family's going to be so great. I'm thinking, what the hell is going on in this picture? Who could do this to this poor infant, this poor harmless baby? And what are they doing to the rest of their life? They're really destroying this kid. I hate that mom. I want to reduce the ability for that mom to have the kids, ability to access care, whatever. And so it really leads to those really, really harmful outcomes for, those families or individuals that are, again, trying to seek treatment or in long-term recovery. And so something just as simple as that image choice, which is an image choice that we see so often, and that word choice of born addicted, it's really emotional. It's very visceral for the public. But if you showed that picture to your friends or neighbors, nobody's going to see that and say like, wow, we should really give people who use drugs during pregnancy a chance and support. So what we want to do, of course, is then reduce that stigma by shifting the language. So there's a lot of evidence for how to do this. And what we want to talk about first is that language is, of course, associated with stigma. So the terminology that's used to describe people with substance use disorders can, of course, influence health professionals and public perception. So while we're talking to a group of experts through experience and through training, it's also important to recognize that this is what leads to potentially or partially those bad policies in certain regions, is because of that stigma and those continued narratives about individuals as not worthy and clean, and dirty. And if they use drugs, they're immoral. So the more we start to think about people like that, the harder it becomes to pass legislation or policies that actually are trying to increase treatment or harm reduction services. And so how do we do that? We use evidence-based approaches to reduce stigma. So person-first language. So many folks are familiar with this. This is describing an individual as a person with a substance use disorder, a person with an opioid addiction, as opposed to an opioid addict. The disease itself is separate from the individual. It's part of them, but it does not define them. So that person-first language is something that's seen in a lot of other spaces and increasingly seen in addiction. And so we push those person-first language. Emphasizing solutions. Ashton's going to do a great job of talking about how you as an expert, when you work with the news media, can talk about some of the solutions. A lot of the media narratives right now are still about the doom and gloom and deaths, and those are really important stories. But we also have really important evidence-based solutions, some of them for decades, that still aren't available in many communities. So if we're just talking about overdose deaths, for example, or alcohol use disorder, and we're not talking about access to care in that same story, that's a really big miss from the media perspective. We also want empathetic narratives that humanize the individual, that provide those societal contexts as opposed to the individual causes of addiction. So those two things in combination, when we provide those stories that way, we actually start to less think about it as this person is to blame and more, wow, things are really complicated and that person had a really tough life and there's a lot of stuff going on. Maybe we should do more to help individuals in that situation. So Ashton, I said a couple times, but Ashton does a wonderful part on Journalism 101 here that I will share control with her for. And she'll be able to run through. I'll be monitoring the chat. So of course, feel free to ask any questions as we're going. Ashton, we can't hear you yet.
Yeah, sorry. So I apologize. When you gave me control of your screen, the unmute button went away and I stumbled there for a second. Sorry about that. And I also think I skipped ahead a couple of slides, but we're gonna continue. We're just fine. Thank you all so much again for having us today. And yeah, before we jump into this, I just want to give just a little bit more context about myself. So I did work in newsrooms for a decade. I am an editor at a newsroom. Jonathan mentioned 100 Days in Appalachia. We're a nonprofit digital newsroom, so I'm continuing to work with reporters in that way. And I also teach journalism at West Virginia University. So you're going to hear me say things about when I was reporting, about my reporters, and then also about, I might just offhand say, my students. So I have kind of all of these spaces that I'm working within, and I just wanted to give that quick context about those things. So why does it even matter that journalists cover addiction, and why are we asking you all to help them? So I think that generally people who are not working in newsrooms and have never worked in newsrooms kind of get this idea that if a journalist is going to cover this topic, they are most likely going to be coming to you as a health reporter or a science reporter, and they're going to have some background in this space. But actually, we have to keep in mind that addiction intersects with almost every area of our lives. And so that means most reporters who are coming to this work actually don't have any background or context, or maybe even basic kind of medical understanding of this disease. So you might have somebody reach out to you who's been a politics reporter for 15 years, and they only touch on this topic when it ends up in their state legislature or on city council. Or maybe they're a military reporter and they only cover veterans issues, and this has now become something that is relevant in that community. So we show you this to just keep that in mind, that these reporters may be coming to you covering addiction from any of these angles, and probably most of these angles kind of at the same time. So we like to do this kind of base setting. We always do, and we do all of our work from this assumption. We do not believe that journalists want to harm their communities. And I'm sure we've all seen really bad headlines or heard really rough interviews on the radio and just think, oh gosh, I wish they would have done better. I promise you, 99% of those journalists didn't wake up that morning and think, I want to do my job poorly and hurt people in my community. They didn't do that. But their jobs are really difficult. Sometimes, like we showed you in that photo, they have to cover many topics at the same time. And so they don't necessarily have time to become experts in that thing. We have really tight deadlines. I worked in newsrooms where I started my day at 9:30 and I had to have all of my stories written, interview multiple sources. I worked in some TV newsrooms where I also had to travel a 6-county radius and collect video, write it and edit it myself, and have that all done at 4:30. So we're working on really, really tight deadlines most of the time. And most of these newsrooms just don't have very many resources, right? And they don't get to do a lot of research or do a lot of really in-depth reporting. And so that's where you all come in. We know that no matter what, the work that journalists do are going to have an impact on our communities and the way that they think about things. They're going to have an impact on policy and legislation or ordinances that are actually passed and go into place, right? And so we're asking you to help them do this work. I'd like to show this really quickly. I know there are lots of numbers and lots of little text here, but this is from the Knight Foundation, and every year they do a report on the state of trust in local news outlets, or they do a state of trust in the media is really what the report is. And basically what this is showing you is that even though we're having issues in the journalism industry with misinformation and disinformation that are the result of and also lead to more issues with trust, people still trust their local news outlets more than any other media outlet in the country. And so some of you are doing really great work that we want to be on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Seattle Times. We want it to be there. But we use this as a reminder that if you really want to make change in your community, you take the time to talk to your local newspaper or do an interview at the 12 o'clock news at your local CBS affiliate, you're really going to have more influence on the community that you live in. Sorry. I think I'm okay. So why do we need you? So we're asking you today to embrace your expertise. You have the training and you have the experience to lead these conversations. And I like to remind folks that to a journalist, you are an expert. You know, even if you've been working in this field for 5 years, guess what? To me, you're an expert. You got a lot more experience than I do. If you have a PhD or a master's degree in this field, you are for sure an expert. So I think that sometimes we think, oh, well, I'm not the executive director, or I'm not the first name on the list of my organization. I promise you that you have the experience that journalists need, and they are struggling to cover these stories because they don't have access to people like you. So you really can make a difference. They really want to serve their communities, but we just don't get trained in how to cover these topics. And so sometimes we do a bad job because somebody like you hasn't met us yet. And if you can intervene, you can really shift the way journalists will trust you, and they will ask you for your help. But we know that you guys don't get training on this either, right? And so hopefully this will help you today. We want you to walk away with tangible things that you can do to improve these interactions. But we know that there's just as much demand on your time as there are for journalists themselves. So we're going to give you some tips about how to navigate some of those things, and when it's okay to say, actually, this is not good for me. And when you can actually maybe even pitch yourself to the journalists and try to influence the reporting in that way. And we just want to remind you that it is really, really valuable. Again, journalists just don't get access to the type of training that they need to cover this topic fully. And so if you can share with them your knowledge, your experience, your understanding of the science, they're just not going to get it anywhere else. They just aren't. So you all really have the opportunity to make a huge shift in this space. So Jonathan mentioned the QR codes. One way that you can start working with journalists really quickly is to add yourself to our database of experts. I will also drop a link in the chat here in a few minutes. That QR code should take you to the page to sign up for our expert database. But as journalists are coming to us and asking for help to cover these stories, sometimes that's the first place that we send them. You can put things in there like a link to your bio page, your areas of expertise, your city and state, so that a local journalist can find you more easily. And I know that you see on the picture there that email button. That email button actually comes to us, and then we help them connect with you. So don't think that if you put yourself on this list, you're going to get 60 emails a day for forever. That's not, we try to help you navigate those things, but this is a place where at least they can start figuring out who you are in their community and access it really easily. So again, we're kind of on the journalism 101, like what is even happening in newsrooms? How do they do their jobs? And they're finding you sometimes through your research. So if you're publishing research in academic journals, other white papers, places where you would have formal publication processes, oftentimes journalists will find you in that way. It is going to be very rare that they're going to find that research and ask you to do an interview on that specific study findings. more likely than not, and I've done this many, many times as a journalist, I think, oh, Jonathan published this paper talking very, very specifically about pregnant women and addiction. I want to do a story about addiction more broadly, but we're in the same town. And so I know that he can talk about this thing, right? And so I'm going to reach out to him, maybe on something that's a little bit more broad than his narrowly focused research at this point. But again, you're trying to build that relationship with them. That's what we're hoping you're going to want to do. So don't try to be a one-off source and think, well, you weren't interested in that specific paper, so I don't really want to take the time to talk to you. If you can start a relationship with them, talking broadly about your job and your experience, they're going to come back to you over and over again. Journalists are often finding you on social media. So if you don't have a social media presence, that might be something that you want to consider. Twitter is still, I mean, there are lots of conversations in the industry right now about Twitter, but I would say it's still of worth to be there, at least for now. Facebook is usable, definitely. LinkedIn is actually the place that's the most common for journalists to try to find you. So having those pages, even with just the basics set up, so we get some understanding of your area of expertise, where you are, where you work currently and maybe have in the past, that makes us feel like you're a real person that we can reach out to. I use use hashtags, don't reinvent the wheel. You know, if you're already on, especially Twitter, I think this is where it's the most relevant, and you're already someone who's active in that space, and you're taking part in conversations, you're sharing your work on that space. See what hashtags are already being used in these conversations and start using them yourself. Those conversations, hashtags allow us to group things in conversations, right? Insert yourself into the conversation that already exists by just using a quick hashtag that you've seen used in other places. It allows journalists to find you faster. And then a link tree, or there are some other things, link in bio is another one. Some are free, some you have to buy, but this is a place where you can organize your information. So you could put a link to your bio page on your organization's website. You could say, you know, I was on a podcast 2 years ago. I thought it was a great interview. You can link to that interview. You can gather things that allow the journalist basically to do that vetting of you very quickly, so that they know kind of, okay, she's comfortable speaking on camera, so I'm going to ask her to talk to me for my TV story. Those are really, really valuable and help cut down on that time. We talked about the pressures on your time and the pressures on the journalist's time themselves. If you don't have time to speak to them, but you know that there's another person in your organization, or another person at a partner organization, or at the local university, you don't have to give them everything. But even to be able to say, actually, if you talk to Dr. Stoltman, and I can't help you find him right now, but he teaches up at Grand Rapids, you could find him pretty quickly. I can't talk to you today. I'd love to talk to you in the future, but I think Dr. Stoltman's a good one. Just pushing them, nudging them in another direction. I can't tell you how helpful that is. When I need to find someone in an hour and do a 20-minute interview with them, and you just have another recommendation for me, it helps so, so much. And that's building that relationship with them. So if today doesn't work, but you know somebody else and you've got a name for them, say, maybe you could come back to me next time, but here's this person that might be able to help you today. But we always say, if you are going to do that, if you're going to point someone in another direction, I would guess that most of you are not going to point them to someone who has a harmful narrative to share. But if there are red flags that you see, whether that is, you know, red flags that come to that person's research, or the kind of science that they are doing, I don't know, any of those things, any red flags that you might see with that person, you kind of do have a responsibility to point those things out. You know, we have conversations with journalists about community-based treatment, and we tell them, you know, I don't believe that the folks who have a community home in my neighborhood, I don't believe that they're doing a bad thing. But when they say we don't provide access to medication, oh, that's a flag in your head that you should say, oh, why don't you do that? Why don't you? I did a story one time where they said, we don't provide medication. And I said, oh, why? And their response was, we've just not been able to get the Medicaid reimbursement worked out yet. We want to, but we're not there yet, right? So journalists don't necessarily know that they need to even ask that question. So if there's a red flag that's nagging you a little bit, you don't have to speak to them today, but maybe do let them know what that red flag is. You also should vet the journalist. And we get this question a lot. How do I go about doing that? How do I figure out if they're even worth my time or if they have an agenda and I don't really want to speak to them? So the easiest thing that you can do is you should be able to figure out pretty quickly who they work for. They probably should have told you that in their request to you. If they're reaching out to you for an interview, they probably would have told you which media outlet they work for. But when you start working with bigger and bigger outlets, you're going to run into freelance journalists a lot, right? And so they may be a journalist who is starting this story on spec, which means they're going to gather sources and gather information so that they can convince that editor at the magazine that they actually want this story. So if they didn't tell you outright, perfectly fine. You should definitely ask who they work for and then try to do some digging and make sure that that's actually the case. Any real legitimate journalist is sharing their stuff on social media. We are trying to get eyeballs on our content as much as possible. And so if you go to their social media accounts and it doesn't say in their bio what news outlet they work for, they've never shared a clip of their own of a past story, you might be working with a brand new journalist. That could be the case. Somebody who's right out of school and just trying to get their footing. But if there is no social media presence, that also should be a flag for you that, okay, maybe I need to think about this a little bit more or talk to them a little bit more before I agree. And as you're looking at their media outlets, these things are really probably something that you can find on their webpage really easily. They either have an about page or a mission statement. A lot of people with bad intentions, I guess that's the way I'll say it, will set up these kind of lookalike news outlets, and they don't have any of this stuff. They don't have an about page. They certainly don't have a mission statement. Hold on one second. Excuse me. Every news organization wants to communicate to their community what they value and what they're there to do. Every news outlet should have bylines and dates on their stories. Think about what journalists want to be. I want you to know that I did this work, and I want you to know that I did this work first. So the byline is their name. If there's no name on the articles, that should be a red flag for you. And if there's no date on their stories, that should be a red flag for you too. An address or a physical location for their office is pretty common. I say with a caveat because you will not be able to find the address for my media outlet on our website. That's because one of our biggest areas of coverage is white nationalism and domestic extremism. And that makes us a target, and we've dealt with a lot of threats. So an address or physical location is very typical, but I will say sometimes there's a little caveat. I promise my newsroom is real, but we also have to protect ourselves and the people who are working for us. And then if you're still unsure after you've looked at all this stuff, it is totally fine for you to say, you know, I'd like to think about it a little bit more. Could I speak with the editor that you're working with? Could I have their email address or their phone number? And that person should be willing to have a conversation with you about that journalist or at the very least about the media outlet. Those are some good things to keep in mind as you're thinking through, okay, am I going to work with this journalist? I don't see any questions so far in the chat, so I'm going to keep going. I realize we're moving fast though, so please feel free to drop those questions in. Okay, so how a journalist is preparing to interview you. You've received a call, you've looked through, you feel pretty confident that this person is going to keep an open mind and is going to do a good job reporting this story, so you've agreed to speak with them. We hear all the time that journalists have no idea what they're talking about. They are the dumbest people and they never prepare to come talk to me. They never prepare for these interviews. Well, there are some things to keep in mind. The medium through which the journalist is communicating to their audience often dictates how that interview is going to go. So they may ask you some very, very basic questions, but they've got a TV camera in front of you. And so if they can't get you saying those things on tape, they can't use them in their story. They have to make assumptions then in their script, right? They want you to say these things. So when it's audio or video, you may feel like, oh, they're asking me things they should already know. but I have to be able to let my audience see or hear you saying these things sometimes. Also remember that they're working on those tight deadlines again. So especially if an emergency comes up in the community, if there is a heavy string of overdoses within a 6-hour period, and they're getting press releases from the sheriff's department saying something about the street drugs that have come into this community and wanting to do warnings, and they're looking for an expert to speak on that really, really quickly, they might have had 10 minutes to look at that press release, figure out if they even trust what the sheriff's department is saying, all while they're also trying to find an expert in this space and get something on the page in 20 minutes. I mean, it can happen so fast. So sometimes just the nature of the beast is that we really can't prepare. We just have to go for it. And that may result in some questions that feel a little bit basic, but we're just trying to get as much information as we possibly can as fast as possible. And, sometimes also those stories get assigned moments before. If there is breaking news, somebody may have scheduled an interview with you. There's breaking news. That reporter gets pulled from the story and another reporter is calling you saying, actually, I'm going to be conducting this interview today, but I just found out 3 minutes ago because now my colleague is down the street at a fire. So sometimes those people can get switched out really fast, and they just don't get any time to prepare for those things. Remember, in those moments, if you've been asked to participate in a story, they should have, and you should be asking them to explain your purpose and your role in that story, but help them with that story, especially if they've communicated with you that they're on a very tight deadline. We would love if you had other story ideas or additional thoughts to share with them. These journalists have to come up with sometimes multiple stories a day. They are going to love if you have a story idea for them. But in that moment, when they're really pressured to get this done quickly, sometimes that can come off as this person's being difficult and they don't want to work with me. And so I'm not going to go back to them. So when they're in that moment on that deadline, help them with that story and then say, hey, could I have your email address? I have some other ideas and things I'd love to talk to you about when you've got a little bit more time. That goal is to build that relationship with them so they feel they feel comfortable coming back to you over and over and over again. And anytime the opportunity presents itself, push them to solutions. When those interviews happen really quickly and we're trying to maybe react to something in the moment and we're asking your help for that, we may not be thinking about the future, right? What are the fixes and what is the future? Almost always, a journalist will say at the very end, the very last question, I tell my students this almost every day. The very last question is, do you have anything else to add? Or is there anything that I missed that you'd also like to talk about? That's your opportunity to start pushing them towards solutions. And even if it doesn't appear in that story, that's another place that you can follow up and have a second story about the solutions to this problem that has just popped up in our community. We recognize that it's not always journalists who are coming to you. You may want to pitch something to them, whether that is an opinion piece or you would like to pitch yourself as an interview for an issue that you think needs to be talked about, needs to be covered. So some ideas or some tips when you actually want to pitch yourself to a journalist. Pay attention to their news before you reach out. And that may seem pretty basic and pretty minor, but read or listen to or watch their news for a little bit before you actually pitch them. Because you don't know what's happening necessarily. We all have very busy lives and we may not have caught the breaking news of the day. And that's going to significantly shift how somebody receives your thought or receives your pitch. Maybe there is a scandal that is breaking out in the governor's office. Somebody has embezzled, the chief of staff has embezzled money. They're going to shift the entire newsroom to covering this topic. And that's not necessarily the best time for you to say, hey, we don't see any coverage of such and such issue about addiction. I would really love to do a story about that with you, right? in that moment, it's not going to be accepted very well. But if you know that we're just in a typical news cycle, there's no pressing issues going on, and that's the appropriate time to pitch and actually get a really good response. In those pitches, it's also important for you to explain, to have an understanding of the audience that they're trying to reach. So who is it that they cover? And most local newsrooms are covering a community, covering a geographic place. So that's helpful. But in your pitch, it really helps if you can explain why the audience cares about this topic or how it impacts this specific community. Sometimes some of us, I think I'm very guilty of this too, now being in an academic space, we kind of see everything up here at this high level. And what journalists are really looking for is, okay, why does this matter on the ground? Why does it matter to the day-to-day person? They're that intermediary, right? That translator from this research paper in this academic journal to the folks who are the boots on the ground and actually doing maybe the harm reduction work. So they're looking for you to explain to them how it impacts the audience that they're trying to reach. Always include your pitch, obviously your current pitch, but it's really helpful if you then just get into the habit of having a brief bio at the bottom of all of your emails. They might not be able to act on your pitch right now, but now they have a name, right? And so I can't tell you how many times I've gotten an email from someone thought, oh, that person, I was an education reporter for a long time. Oh, that person is a former high school teacher and now they work in policy. And I can't do this story today, but I'm going to save it in my inbox or put it in this folder so that I know the next time that story comes up, I can start with that person. So that bio at the end gives them a sense of all of the work that you do and knowing that they can come back to you later. And then something to keep in mind, if you pay super close attention to your local media outlets, you will know that they often wait when big stories break, they often take those national stories and find a way to make it relevant in their community to their local audience. I teach my students to do this all the time. Localize it, right? That's what I say. Localize it, localize it. When you see those national stories happening, and the example we talk about is rainbow fentanyl right before Halloween. That the DEA put out all these press releases to the media about you have to be careful because rainbow fentanyl will be in your kids' trick-or-treating candy. And you as a professional in this space know that's absolutely ridiculous. Like, that's not going to happen. I think that people who are selling rainbow fentanyl, like they're doing it to make money, and they don't make money when they give it away for free to 6-year-olds. Like, they're not going to come back and buy more of this. So, I mean, there are lots of reasons why it's ridiculous, right? If you can intervene when you see that happening, you're going to become so valuable to your local newsroom. You see Good Morning America doing the story about rainbow fentanyl and trick-or-treating. Contact your local newsroom and say, hey, I saw this on the national news today. I'd really like to talk about why that's just not reasonable in the community that we live in, and try to give parents the information that they can actually use. Being that intermediary in your community is huge. It's so huge. They really need that help. So I have a question from Jennifer. How do you address specific stigmatizing language, phrases you would like the reporter to not use or use in their pieces? This one is really difficult, right? I think, one area of language that we're really focusing on is that person first language, right? That shift away from calling someone an addict and to that person first, a person with a substance use disorder. What I would say is a couple of things. One, continually use that language when you are speaking to journalists. So even when they ask you a question that says, what do you think about the addicts downtown? Respond with the correct language. Well, it's better if we call them a person with a substance use disorder, because it helps humanize that person and recognize that their disease, like I would literally make it my answer to their question, an explanation of the language, and then answering the question itself. Continuing to shift them back toward that language, always using the language yourself in any answer or any interaction you have with the journalist. They're going to hear that and recognize, oh, am I not saying this right? Like, should I be using something else? The other thing that I would say is, again, I know that this is not universal, but most journalists want to learn and they want to do a better job. And so if you're always approaching it from a place of educating them and not correcting or criticizing, you're going to get a better response from them. And I think that we have to kind of remember, this might be in our slides later on, but we have to kind of remember that our journalists have to fail in public, right? If you make a mistake at your job today, hopefully it doesn't harm anyone. Maybe your boss and a couple of your colleagues saw that mistake, you took action and corrected it, and that was that. If I make a mistake, I was a public broadcasting reporter. If I make a mistake during the 4:30 newscast during All Things Considered, everybody heard my mistake. Everyone, every 300,000 people in West Virginia heard me make that mistake. So approaching it from that place of education is really important because they're failing in public, they're failing in the open. And we just have to remember that we can always treat them with a little bit of care. I am gonna come back to questions, I promise, but while we're here, we have also this guide that I think, Jennifer, you could pull, and that might help assist as well. So this is a checklist, and on the back side, we have some more information for journalists specific to language. If you have agreed to do an interview with a journalist, sometimes just passing along this one-page kind of primer about covering addiction can also help them prepare for that conversation and recognize, oh, this says, instead of saying addict, use person with a substance use disorder. You know, those kinds of primers can help maybe cut off some of those issues before you even get into the room with them. And we'll share again the link. You can find it on our homepage. There's a QR code there. I'll drop the link into the chat as well. Oh, thank you. Somebody just did. I appreciate it. If you've agreed to do the interview, as you are preparing, remember that, or not remember, you may not know this. When I teach student journalists, I get them at 18 years old and we talk about what journalism is. The first thing I tell them is your job is to talk to people at a 5th grade reading level. So I'm teaching college students who have spent years prepping for SATs and ACTs and writing entrance exams to now stop doing everything that they learned and write in the most simple and basic way. And your journalist needs you to do that too. So the best way that you can do that is if you've got a sense of what this story is about, distill your message down, again, that 5th grade reading level, to 3 basic things. These are the 3 most important things I want to get across in this interview. If you have time, practice them. Practice saying them out loud. That's really helpful, especially if you're doing an audio or television interview. It's also perfectly okay for you to have them in front of you during the interview itself. Now, a TV reporter is not going to be happy if the paper is up here and in front of your face in the shot, right? But there's no reason why it can't be on the desk in front of you, so that after you've finished answering your question, or they ask a question that you know is in your points, take a second and glance at them and say, okay, now I'm ready. Now in a live interview, obviously that's a little bit different, but having those points in front of you in writing, totally fine. Nobody is going to ask you not to do that. And then we've got that, again, reminder to just respond to them really quickly because they're on that tight deadline. And just getting back to them, even getting back to them to say no, is so much more helpful than just not responding to their requests. Okay, so our Amber as asking, are homelessness, DV, and trafficking being addressed via your group as well? So we do not specifically we do not have specific guidelines or guidance for reporters on those topics, but we do often, as we're training journalists and we're doing trainings for them, talk about the intersectionality of a lot of those and how the language is still universal. So I am constantly teaching my students and teaching journalists that it is actually not okay to say that somebody is homeless anymore. They are a person who is unhoused, right? And that is what the language That's the language that we're starting to hear and see more and more in the news, right? Everybody is doing this shift to this person first language. So we'll talk about those issues kind of in the intersectionality of addiction, but we are not specifically taking on kind of language or reporting in those spaces. Okay, I'm going to keep my eyes on the chat, but I'm going to keep pushing through because I know we're almost out of time. Okay, so how to approach the interview itself. Again, treating it as a learning process. Your goal is not to get this journalist to be perfect after one interaction with you. One time talking to them about this topic is not going to be enough. So following up with them, helping them continue to learn about this topic is really, really important. Oh, you meant via stigma, but also, yes. Okay, sorry, Amber. Yes. So the importance of, a journalist is not aware of the expanse of your expertise, and they will take what you say and use it, even if you caveat it with, well, I don't know a ton about this topic, but what I'll tell you is, right, for me, I'm going to cut, but I don't know enough about this topic. I'm going to cut that out because I still need to use this soundbite, right? So remember, kind of stay in your lane, stick to the things that you know. And if you're struggling kind of with any of those additional areas, that's where you can always point your journalist toward somebody else, somebody who might be better to understand those. And again, you don't have the responsibility to find another interview for them, but it does help if you can point them toward people that you trust and that you believe in and point out those red flags. And then I just want to clarify really quickly the difference between on and off the record, because we often, some people in this space are actually eager to work with journalists, like very eager to help them, but they don't kind of recognize where those boundaries are for themselves personally. So you should assume that every interaction you have with a journalist is on the record. Even if you're just on the phone, you're getting ready for the interview, you're getting an understanding of their story, you should assume that it's on the record. The only time you are off the record is when you literally say it. This is off the record, but I want you to know this, this, and this, right? I would consider saying that when you're pointing them toward red flags. This is off the record, but what I want you to know about this doctor is this, right? You then need to clarify when you are back on the record. Another phrase that you might hear journalists throw around is on background. On background means that they are not going to attribute that information to you personally, but they still can use that information in their story to help guide and frame their reporting. So on and off the record, and then on background, those are really good kind of identifiers to be aware of.
Ashton, do you mind if we jump in? There's a question that people keep flagging, and I did see it initially, but like it got like moved and I can't touch the chat. It like moves the screen. So the question was about touching the issues around fentanyl exposure and like overdoses and law enforcement and how we can help with that. So I mean, I can answer it, but if you want to, that's fine.
No. I'll ask you to add if you have anything else. This actually came up in a text in my family text yesterday. My mom works for a gasoline company. They sell and distribute gasoline, and her office happens to be at essentially a gas station, right? Their office building is directly behind it, and they had someone unfortunately overdose and pass away at their site this week. And my sister said, don't touch anything because you don't know what that drug is and it will get in your skin and you could, right? And I had to like, whoo, okay, let's talk about what's happening here, right? This is a pervasive issue in our communities and people. So I think the best thing that you can do is, well, you have to start building the relationship with the journalist first, but I think you really need to start pointing them toward research, or if there are websites that you have access to that explain kind of these phenomenons, you need to start pointing them towards the science. Journalists, especially local journalists, default to believing people in power. And the reason that we do that is time, right? It's just time. That has started to shift in younger journalists. They do question power a little bit more. I think that 2020 and all of the things with Black Lives Matter really have shifted their frame of reference. Most local journalists default to power. The sheriff said that, the sheriff must know. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this story. Starting to have conversations with them now about the science and about why they should question those stories, and starting to talk to them about who the experts actually are. Sheriffs did not, most of them, I would venture to say all, but I'm going to say most, did not get their PhD in addiction science and then decide that they wanted to go into law enforcement and are now sheriff, right? Like that's not typically how it happens. Again, it's approaching the conversation from educating them and helping them understand the topic. But it's also then, I think, sometimes saying, you know, that's not what the science shows. I don't think our sheriff is a bad person, but he also doesn't understand the science. And I think we've got to be kind of explicit about that part of the conversation. Jonathan, you want to add anything?
I think the only thing is that we are developing a toolkit around this because it's a question that we get a lot from specific communities, because it's always one of those ones that like either comes from a small community and then like explodes nationally or goes the other direction. So we are trying to develop some resources for templates so that you can email your local reporters when they're doing that work. But Ashton's point, of course, is really important. Building that relationship now is going to be super important, because then when that story comes across our desk, they call you first. And that's the goal, right? Is then when they get that quote from the sheriff, they also have that quote from you that like, you know, physiologically, that's not likely to have been what happened. And here's why that's important. And here's why that's harmful when you actually continue to perpetuate this. Because like Ashton said, this is still like my family. I don't know why. They all still believe it, like a lot of people. And that's because they hear it from the news. And so the news continues to be a really reliable source of information for folks. And if we don't have scientists or experts like yourself helping the news shape those stories, that's going to continue to be a problem. I did see there was another really good question about how to distill your quotes, which Ashton's actually going to talk about now anyways. And we are running close to time. I think we only got a couple slides anyway. So if you want to just jump back into that.
I'm going to go quickly. I'm not going to really hit on all of the points in this slide, but I'm going to kind of try to address Mandy's question with what's on this slide. Yeah, I know it's really hard. What I'm saying to you is take this incredibly difficult thing that you've spent years working on and studying, and you know that it's not black and white, and just simplify it and try to explain it to a fifth grader. I know that that's impossible. I really do. But I think you have to be explicit, and you have to say to reporters, it's not as simple as that. And if their question is setting you up for an either or, for a black and white, and you know that it cannot be that, it can't be that. You have to kind of shake them out of this conversation, right? It's not as simple as that, and I'm going to explain to you why. Distilling your message down to those 3 points before you start is really going to help you. Asking the question, does that make sense? You're allowed to ask that. I ask that of my students all the time. Did that make sense to you? Do we need to boil it down more? That's going to reduce those miscommunications, or maybe jerk that reporter out of it's either this or that. I had another thought about this and now it just left my brain. Anyways, it's being explicit with them that it is not that simple. I think you have to just be willing to straight out say it. It's not that easy. And that will hopefully help them. Oh, the other thing I was going to say, and I think it was Mandy that asked this question, you can absolutely send me an email or send Jonathan an email and say, I'm going to talk about this thing. This topic is really complicated. Here's how I've tried to distill it. Is that enough? We would love to help you with that. We would be more than happy to.
And I think the heuristic that we try to say to like fifth grade, but like think about your neighbors, or like I like to use my grandma. She for some reason like understands all this stuff, but I talk to her about it very differently than I talk to y'all about it, right? And so even if we're in that space professionally, we're used to talking about naltrexone to our patients, talking about it to your grandma is going to be a really different conversation, hopefully, because you should approach it with much more simpler language, straightforward, et cetera.
And the last thing, I know we're almost out of time, is just say thank you, follow up and say thanks, building relationships, let them know. And if they got something wrong, The thank you email is a great time to follow up and say, hey, this wasn't so great. Maybe we could work on this next time, approaching it from educating the journalist. Okay, I think that's it. I think that's all of them.
Thank you, Jonathan and Ashton. We really appreciate your time today and for getting through the questions. And this was great content, very unique from some of our other webinars. So I appreciate that. Please remember to fill out our evaluation survey for today's webinar by clicking in the link within the email we'll be sending out later today. It's also up there in the chat box, probably a little further up. And join us for our next webinar on February 15th. That'll be in collaboration with our partners at the Clinical Trials Network. And it's titled Digital Therapeutics in the Treatment of Substance Use Disorders, State of the Science and Vision for the Future. And thank you everyone for joining us today and for our wonderful presenters.
Thank you.